Hey everybody, how's it going today? Welcome to Truth Be Told. Thanks very much for listening in. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about Noah and some of his actions post-flood, especially as it relates to him sending out the raven and the dove. And I think this is a really interesting topic. I'm excited about it strictly because this is something that yields a lot of study, a lot of questions. People have made a lot of content about this topic, but there is no one agreed upon perfect answer. And you might say, well, Micah, across Christianity, there's not a lot of agreed upon answers of anything. And then you go into world religions, even less agreement as far as that goes. But this is something that it doesn't really fit into any one religious teaching or one religion's dogma or anything like that. It's kind of a fringe thought in the sense that it doesn't inform something foundational or fundamental to any one system of belief. And so it's something that people feel free to study and discuss, but it isn't something that we can really get too up in arms about unless we've decided to make it dogmatic, which we really shouldn't, because it just doesn't need that. But it doesn't make it any less important to consider or to study. This is a part of Scripture. And to ask questions about Scripture, to be interested in something, I think that's kind of why God leaves some things a little bit ambiguous for us to have conversation, to see how are they going to handle this when they're not 100% sure. Are they going to fight each other and backbite each other? Or are they going to have good discussion and kind of do the iron sharpens iron thing? And I think that's really what we need to be doing. That's why I get excited about conversations like these, because I know some people can tend to think that conversations that are kind of out on a limb a little bit are scary, because the fear is, well, the person talking about them is making them foundational, fundamental, salvational. I'm not doing that at all. But if we put them in their proper place, knowing that these things, whether I'm right, you're right, someone else is right, are not terribly important. Yes, there is one right answer, but it could just be that we can't find out until we are with God again, and He can speak to us face to face and tell us some of the answers to our questions. But if we can have the humility to come to Scripture and say, there are things I just don't know for sure, and it's okay that I don't know them, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on them, because I might glean some better understanding or some better context. I think this is a wonderful place to be, and I think practicing these things, while it seems like, fringe discussion that isn't necessary, isn't important, just creates division and strife, I think if we can practice those things in the arenas that don't matter so much, then it can begin to inform how we interact with people in arenas where it does matter, where things are fundamental and foundational, to still have humility going into those conversations and say, maybe I don't know every single thing there is to know about this. And maybe I should not treat the person who believes differently than me as an enemy in this conversation, because that doesn't yield anything good. If you truly want to be understood, you truly want to be heard, then you have to be willing to understand and hear the other person, even if they disagree with you. So some of these lesser ticket items in Scripture, I think, are really good practice, really good training ground for some of those more dense conversations we can have. So like I said, this conversation, it has no perfect answer. I don't have one specific interpretation that I'm going to lead you to or say this must be it. I do probably have my own, even unintentionally, my own view of what's probably going on here, but I don't know for a fact. And so it's really for you to hear what I've got to say, understand the theories that I'm going to bring forward that other people have spoken about, and decide for yourself. But feel free to comment if you've heard something different or you believe something different about this. That discussion is really what sharpens us, both in our interactions with one another, but also in our understanding of the text. So a few cautions before we get started. One, let's study the evidence without going beyond the text. So often when we get into conversations like this and they are not something fundamental to a person's belief, they feel really strongly about coming up with their interpretation and defending that interpretation. It's almost like wanting to be the first person to step foot in new territory. It's like, this is mine, this belongs to me, this is my corner of the market. And when we do this and we begin to defend that territory, that belief, we can do so at the expense of Scripture and the truth that's already found in it. So let's just study the evidence at face value rather than going beyond what the text actually says. Also, let's resist that tendency towards dogmatism, especially because it can make us begin to think less of other people's conclusions, and that only succeeds in making us unable to be sharpened. It's kind of like having the stance that, well, I'm already perfectly sharp. I already know exactly what's going on here. And I don't know that you can be confident to say that in a section like this. But then it also begins to make you think less of other people who reach different conclusions. And that's a really dangerous place to be. Let's just not feel forced to draw conclusions about something that is unknown. When you look across the landscape of Christian literature on this, even as far back as the early church fathers, there is a variety of opinions based on the text here about Noah sending out these two birds. And so we need to practice this too, where we look at Scripture, and if there's a place we don't know, we need to practice saying, I'm okay not knowing for now. I'm okay having an opinion based on the evidence, but I'm okay not knowing for right now. That's a perfectly acceptable place to be, especially with some of these non-foundational topics. So let's get into it then with those cautions out of the way. Why did Noah send out a raven and a dove? On face value, it does seem as if he sent these things out, these two birds, to determine the state of the world after the flood. And we can determine this because he sends one out, he sends one out, he sends one out, he sends one out, and then when that changes, when the return of that bird changes, or at least when the return of the dove changes, that is when he determines it is now time to leave the ark. It is now okay on the face of the earth to go out from this boat. But why send out these two birds in this series of send out events? It reads very much like a children's story or something like that. I really love how it's written. It's kind of poetic. There's kind of a pattern and a rhythm to it that's very natural. And I think people with analytical brains would read this and say, there's something going on here. I don't know what. And maybe, to be fair, maybe those people with analytical brains are reading a little bit too far into the text, because I know there are some of you on the more conservative side of thinking that would say, well, it's written that way, Micah, because that's exactly what happened. And I'm not saying you're wrong. People have speculated about this story for years, and maybe you haven't. Maybe you've come to this text and you're like, I don't even understand what the point is in talking about this. But the reality is, people of all different levels of education throughout history, throughout Christendom, have found this section important to talk about in commentaries and in dissertations and in writings. And so why not cover it here today? But people have speculated about this for a long time, and they take kind of two routes, or one of two routes along a spectrum. Some are either super symbolic, and this does not necessarily mean that they are wrong, and some are hyper literal, and this doesn't mean that they are necessarily wrong. I personally take the stance that this is a literal event, that Noah was a real human being that lived, and he actually did send out real physical birds to determine the state of the earth after the flood had occurred. But I also don't reject the idea that this could have been written in a way that emphasizes symbolism, or that God might have intended these real things to kind of continue in a pattern to follow a certain symbolism over time. An example of this that we can see very plainly in Scripture, I think, is when Abraham he meets with God and two angels, and he presents them with bread and with wine. Now, did he really do this? I believe, yes, that this was a literal historical event. But bread and wine, we see this as a symbol and as a pattern throughout the Old Testament. That is also true. And this pattern pointed to a larger event, thus making those previous iterations of that pattern symbolic. This is all true. It's literal and it's symbolic at the exact same time. So even though it can be very tempting to say it's either literal or symbolic, I think we need to reject this and say, sometimes it can be both, especially when God is writing the story. So what are the theories about what the raven and the dove are doing in the story, about what they mean or what they represent in the symbolic and the literal? I'll just start at the beginning. Some believe that the raven represents evil. It is a darker colored bird. It's a scavenger. Even in our own modern poetry, a raven would be considered like, more on the dark side of things. Think of like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, right? Then you have the dove, representative of goodness. There is light in its coloring. It is harmless as a dove is something that, that's an idiom that we know of. It's a symbol of peace in even our modern culture today, but also in Hebrew culture throughout Scripture. And so this idea that one represents evil, one represents good, potentially, I don't exactly know where this comes in because I don't specifically see the raven doing anything wrong specifically or evil, although it does not bring back signs of explicit life necessarily. But that's one theory, that the raven is evil, the dove is goodness, and both are released onto the face of the earth. Some go as far as to say that the raven is actually representative of Satan, while the dove is representative of God. And they use kind of interesting thinking to get here. It says that the raven went to and fro over the face of the earth. And we see that Satan also does this in the book of Job. He walks to and fro over the face of the earth. Okay. I'm not going to say that's not valid in the sense that that is one way to draw connections in Scripture. Whenever people across books and across time use similar phrases, and you see that happening again and again and again, it might be the authors trying to clue you into something. That's possible. Here, I'm only seeing it happen one time with the raven and one time with Satan, although one is flying and one is walking. But okay, there might be something here. A raven is an unclean bird. A dove is a clean bird. So it's very possible. They also say that the dove went over the face of the waters, but found no place to put her foot. And they tie this into Genesis 1, where the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the waters. So that's kind of the justification for that belief. Interestingly, the opposite of the raven is also true. Some believe the raven and the dove both represent God in a way, because the raven went to and fro over the face of the waters, and they equate this with the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. So the same reasoning applied to different birds. I think that's interesting. And then the dove, in this view, represents God in the sense that it sought rest and sustainability. It brought back a symbol of peace, an olive branch. And so for those reasons, some believe that both creatures represent God. Some just believe that the raven is a raven and the dove is a dove. And I want to explore that for just a minute, because I think it is important to get a plain reading of the Scripture and just see what happens in the text. What might the text be trying to tell us literally about this story before we then apply symbols to these things, or kind of draw out symbols from them, rather. Noah in this story is witnessing a recreation of the earth. Just like it was in Genesis 1, the earth is again formless and it is void. It is tohu and it is bohu, which means it is uninhabitable, it is hostile, it is chaotic. And that is how the earth was. It's how it was presented to us in Genesis 1:1. And here it is again. It's got waters covering the face of it, but clearly it has been destroyed. It is tohu and bohu. Now, it is possible that Noah is familiar with the creation story that we find in Genesis 1. I fully believe that he was, actually, because even though Genesis was written later after Noah's life, it had to come from somewhere. And Moses even writes this. These are the genealogies. These are the histories. It seems like he's drawing from sources to compile his Genesis narrative. And I believe this was passed down from Adam onto his children. So it's very possible Noah knows this story and is using this story as cues for how to act. I mean, admittedly, if I found myself in a giant flood on the top of a mountain, I'd probably think back to, okay, what did Noah do? Because, that's the only time you have this happening again. So Noah's looking back to Genesis 1 and being like, all right, how did this, recreation of the world happen? How did God do all this? What's the order of events, and what do I need to be doing while this is going on? As the water begins to recede from the earth and the mountains are visible, he sends out these two birds, and eventually when the dove does not return, he takes it as a sign that they all can leave, him, his family, the animals. I think it's really interesting how closely Genesis 8 mirrors Genesis 1. It's not precise, but all of the elements are there. It's not precise as far as like exact order necessarily, but it is the content is all the same. There's an ordering and a reordering of things right in front of Noah's eyes. If we think about creation for a second, we have, in a very general sense, we have the waters divided from the sky, the day from the night, land from water, so that now we have these distinct layers, these three distinct layers, heaven, earth, and waters, and they are kind of governed by day and night. In the flood recession, we have the heavens that shut up the waters in them, the waters recede from the land, and once again, we are waiting to see heavens, earth, and waters in their right places. There's an ordering of things that's happening here. And we also know that day and night exist because it says, like on the 40th day, and it says in such and such a month, at such and such a time. So we know that these elements are present and Noah can see them. But the next step in creation, after these kind of tiers of existence or creation are formed, the next step is that the earth sprouts forth vegetation. And after this, you have the waters teeming with life, and you have creatures brought forth from the earth. And while we know that water life probably wasn't affected by a flood, it seems like it is these steps right here that we find Noah trying to glean some information about the earth. Is the earth habitable again? Yes, I can see the tops of the mountains, I can see the sky, I can see the waters, but are they in their proper places? Are they habitable for mankind, for creation? Can these steps of recreation take place where the waters are teeming with animals, the land is teeming with land animals, and the skies are filled with birds? So he sends out a raven, a scavenger bird who can fly very far and very long. Now, a raven does not need vegetation to survive. A raven, like I said, is a scavenger. It needs carrion, which is going to be abundant after a flood that destroyed all this life on the earth. And it never explicitly returns to the ark. It just goes back and forth over the face of the earth. So it's sustained enough for that type of creature. This is one stage of habitability, but it's not quite all the way. You know, if I went into a land where there was only dead things and nothing living, could I survive there? Well, no, because my body can't digest rotting dead things. I'm not a scavenger, but a raven can. So this is one stage of habitability. But then the dove goes out, and it says that it finds no place to put her foot. So there are mountains showing, but doves are nesting creatures. They need trees. So this shows that the water has not receded to the tree line level. The vegetation has not sprouted forth, as we see in Genesis 1. On her next flight out, though, she does bring back vegetation, showing that this stage of creation is completed. But still, it's interesting that she comes back. You'd think, okay, the trees are showing, she can make nests now. Why come back? Clearly because it's still not habitable enough for this dove to remain out there. So Noah waits a further 7 days and then releases the dove, and it never comes back, clearly showing that it can live in this new world. And now it's time for the next stage of that recreation to take place, for the earth to be filled with all the creatures that swarm upon it, and for Noah and his family to come out as well. Really interestingly, following this pattern, after the animals leave the ark, after his family leaves the ark, in their proper place in creation, God makes a covenant with Noah, and Noah builds an altar to God, which fits very nicely with the seventh-day Sabbath from Genesis 1. Finally, things are at rest. Now, this is a literal explanation for why a dove and why a raven. They are uniquely created creatures that have the ability to determine various steps of habitability. They can act as witnesses to the reversal of tohu and bohu. They can act as witnesses to the sustainability of life on the earth once again. Now, does this make the symbolism that others draw out wrong? No, not necessarily. It makes it interesting. And I'm always interested in hearing people's theories. I think that's great. I've looked up like maybe 20 or 30 articles on this topic alone just in preparation for this episode. But we need to make sure that those are not distorting what we know is already in the text. We don't need to fit the text to our theories. We need the theories to fit in the text. They need to have explanatory power, meaning there's a hole in our understanding, a gap in our knowledge. If we're going to bring forth a theory, it has to be based on the evidence of what is there. So it's great to theorize. It is wonderful to think critically about Scripture and say, what is there, what isn't there, what could possibly explain it, especially if we see it in other parts of Scripture. That holds a lot of weight as well. It's wonderful to have these conversations and discussions, but we need to have them with humility about what we actually know and what we don't know, what we believe, what we think, what we've researched, what we've read. We need to understand ourselves, know ourselves really well to know, am I just holding this very tightly because I want it to be true because it's my thought? Or is it actually true? Does it have explanatory power? Can I prove it? Or do I just have evidence of it? Those are very different things as well. So hopefully this has been interesting to you. I think it's really cool to see kind of a redo of Genesis 1 in Genesis 8. I think that's awesome. But I also think it's cool to hear people's thoughts and theories about why these two birds, why is it written in this poetic, rhythmic way? Is there something to be drawn from that? Are there symbols of good and evil here, or God and Satan here? What can we glean from the text? What do we see in other parts of Scripture that might support those things? I think that's great. Don't mean to be rambling, but I just think these things are really cool. This is what's fascinating about Scripture sometimes, that even in the small things, there can be just endless discussion and conversation that should edify us, not divide us.